The day I understood what had been done to me, I was sitting in an attorney's office in Nashville with a manila folder in my lap and a cup of coffee going cold on the desk between me and the man who had just spent 20 minutes explaining, in the careful and precise language of someone who handles documents for a living and has learned to deliver hard information without editorializing, exactly what the documents in that folder showed and what they meant for me and what they meant for my family and what they meant for my family and what they meant about the years I had spent believing a story about myself that was not, in any meaningful sense, true. The attorney's name was Gerald Marsh, and he had been referred to me by a colleague at work, and I had called him not because I suspected what I was about to find out, but because I had reached a point in my life where the accumulated weight of something I could not fully name had become heavy enough that I needed someone outside the situation to help me understand what I was actually looking at. What I was actually looking at, it turned out, was a family that had made a decision about me when I was 19 years old. A decision made in a back room I was not in. A decision that had shaped the following decade of my life in ways I had been living inside without knowing I was living inside. Them, and the decision was this. When the choice came between protecting my sister and protecting me, they had chosen my sister, and the choosing had not been an accident or an oversight or a thing done in the heat of a moment. It had been deliberate, documented, and sustained for 10 years. And water. Gerald Marsh had the documents. My name is Nadia Calloway, and I am 31 years old, and I want to tell you all of it, the secret and the covering and the price and the truth. Because I think the people who need this story need the full version of it, and the full version begins not in the attorney's office, but in the summer I was 19, in the house where my parents still lived, in the phone call that I received on a July afternoon that changed the direction of my life in ways I would not fully understand for a decade. But before I take you there, I need you to stay with me for the length of this, because the length is the point. Because the 10 years between the phone call and the attorney's office are the story, and I need you inside those years with me. Subscribe right now if you are not already, because this channel continues because you are here and I am not done telling the things that need to be told. And hit the bell so you do not miss what comes next. Let me take you back. My sister Vanessa is 3 years older than me, and from the time we were children there was between us the specific dynamic that I think develops in families where one child is more naturally legible to the parents than the other, where one child instinctively gives the parents what they need in the way they need it, and the other child, through no fault of her own and no particular virtue of the first, simply does not produce that legibility. And I was the less legible one, which is not a complaint about who I am. It is simply a description of the mismatch between my particular personality and my particular parents' particular needs, a mismatch that would not have mattered if the stakes had remained low, but the stakes did not remain low. My parents, Robert and Diane Calloway, are people of their generation in the specific way that their generation produced people who equate love with protection, who understand the parent's job as primarily the management of their children's exposure to consequences, and who, when the consequences become serious enough, will do the thing that feels most like protection, even when the thing that feels most like protection is not, in the larger sense, protective at all. And I want to be clear that this is not a unique failing. It is not the product of exceptional cruelty. It is the product of a specific and recognizable human instinct. The instinct to protect the child in front of you from the thing that is happening right now. And the problem with that instinct, when it is applied without sufficient thought, is that it does not account for the child who is not in front of you, the one who is 4 hours away and whose situation will be reshaped by the protection being offered to the one who is present. What they did to me is an example of that instinct taken past the point of reason, taken past the point of fairness, taken past the point where the protection of one child stops being about love and becomes about something harder to admit, which is the management of the family's version of itself. Let me tell you what the secret was. Vanessa was 22 in the summer I turned 19, and she was in her final year at a university in Memphis, and she was in trouble of the kind that 22-year-olds get into when they have had access to money they did not earn, and a social environment that did not discourage spending it, which is to say she had spent over the course of 2.5 years approximately $64,000 that did not belong to her. She had spent it in the way that people spend money that does not belong to them when they are 22 and the immediate consequences of spending it have not yet arrived, which is to say freely and without the specific accounting that would have revealed the problem earlier, and the money she had spent had come from an account that my parents had established for both of us, a joint education fund from my grandfather's estate, intended to cover the cost of 4 years of college for each of us. And Vanessa, who had access to the account because she was older and had been the first to use it, had drawn on both portions, mine and hers, until what should have been $32,000 of my educational funding was gone. I did not know about the account in any specific way, meaning I knew it existed. My parents had told me when my grandfather died that there was money set aside for my education, but I did not know the balance. I did not know the structure. I did not know that Vanessa had access to it, and I did not know, when the July phone call came, that the account had been emptied. My mother called on a Tuesday afternoon, and her voice had the specific flatness that I had learned over 19 years meant she was managing something she had not fully processed yet, and she said she needed to talk to me about the college fund, and I said okay, and she said there had been some issues with the account, and I said, "What kind of issues?" And she said the balance was lower than expected, and I said how much lower? And there was a pause in which I could hear the specific quality of my mother deciding how much to say, and then she said the account had been significantly drawn down. I said, "How significantly?" She said, "There's essentially nothing left for your portion." I sat with that. Then I said, "What happened?" And my mother said, "Your father and I have been looking into it, and we think there were some administrative errors in how the account was managed, and we are working with the bank to understand the full picture, and I want you to know we are going to figure this out." Administrative errors. I heard those words, and I filed them in the category of explanations that explain nothing while sounding like they explain something. And I asked my mother directly whether Vanessa had anything to do with it, and my mother's pause was half a second longer than it should have been, and she said, "We are still looking into all of that." And I understood from the pause and the language that the thing I was asking about had already been looked into, and the looking had produced an answer that my mother was not going to share with me. I did not have the understanding then that I have now to push further. I was 19 years old, and my mother was managing the information, and I trusted that the managing was in my interest as well as everyone else's, and I let it go. And the letting go was one of the most consequential things I have ever done. Not because letting go was wrong, I could not have known what was being constructed in the space I vacated, but because it was the moment the construction began. What my parents did in the months after that phone call, what I know now from Gerald Marsh's documents and from the conversations that followed the documents, was this. They spoke to Vanessa. They received from Vanessa a full accounting of where the money had gone, and they made a decision, together, the three of them in a room I was not in, that the way this situation was going to be managed was not by telling me the truth and holding Vanessa accountable, but by reframing the situation in terms that protected Vanessa's reputation and distributed the practical damage as widely as possible, which in practice meant distributing it to me. The reframing went like this. My parents told me in September of that year, when I was trying to make sense of how I was going to fund my own college education now that the fund was gone, that the money had been lost in a series of poor investment decisions made by the account manager at the bank, that they were pursuing the matter legally, that it was unlikely to be recovered quickly, and that they were sorry, and that they would help me as much as they could. They told me this, and I believed them because they were my parents, and because the explanation was specific enough to sound credible, and because I had no access to the documents that would have shown me it was not true, and because I was 19 and I needed to believe that the people who were supposed to protect me were protecting me. I took out student loans. I worked part-time through my entire undergraduate degree. Not the modest part-time work of someone supplementing an income they have, but the sustained and scheduled labor of someone for whom the money is not supplemental, but structural. 20 hours a week through my first 2 years and closer to 30 in my junior and senior years, when the balance was clear and the need was clear, and the calculation of how many hours I needed to work to keep myself enrolled required more precision than most students ever have to apply to the question. I graduated with $47,000 of debt that would not have existed if the fund had been intact, debt that I spent the 7 years after graduation paying off, debt that shaped every financial decision I made in my 20s with the specific gravity of an obligation that does not pause. For your other needs, that does not take a month off, because you need new tires, or because your furnace needs replacing, or because there is an opportunity in your career that requires some short-term financial risk, that simply continues requiring payment regardless of what else is happening in your life, month after month, year after year, in a way that makes the word debt inadequate to describe the experience. Because debt sounds like a number, and what I'm describing is a condition, a state of being that colors the texture of every decision that has a financial dimension, which is most decisions, and which produces in the person carrying it a particular kind of exhaustion that is not about being tired, but about being always calculating. I do not tell you this to produce sympathy. I tell you this because the cost needs to be specific and real rather than abstract. And the specific real cost of what my parents did to protect my sister was $47,000 in debt and 7 years of paying it off, and the particular kind of damage that comes from spending your 20s in a state of managed financial constraint that you believe is the result of bad luck in an incompetent bank account manager. Vanessa, in the same period, had her portion of the debt paid off by my parents within 18 months of graduating. I did not know this until the attorney's office. I want to tell you about the years in between, the years between the phone call and the folder, because they are not characterized by any single dramatic event, but by the specific quality of a life lived inside a false story, and I think that quality deserves to be described rather than summarized. I graduated from university in 4.5 years instead of 4 because I had to reduce my course load during the semesters when work demanded more hours, and I graduated without honors. Not because I was not capable of honors-level work, but because the semesters when I was working 30 hours a week and carrying a reduced academic load did not produce the GPA that honors required, and my parents attended my graduation, and they were proud. They were genuinely proud, and I received their pride, and I felt the particular complication of receiving genuine warmth from people who were also the reason the thing being celebrated was harder than it needed to be. I moved to Nashville after graduation because there was a job offer there that I could afford to take given the loans I was carrying, which meant a salary that was higher than what I could have gotten in the city where I grew up. And the move meant distance from my family, which I experienced at the time as simply the natural consequence of adult life, and which I understand now as a further cost of the situation, the cost of building my life in a city I had not chosen for reasons I did not know. Vanessa stayed home. Vanessa, who had spent $64,000 of money that included my educational funding, who had been protected from the consequences of that spending by our parents' decision to absorb those consequences into a false story about bank account managers, stayed in the city where we grew up, and my parents were close to her in the way that parents are close to the child they see regularly, and I was close to them in the way that adult children who live 4 hours away are close, which is phone calls and holidays, and the particular relationship that is maintained across distance, and that does not have the daily texture of proximity. I am not telling you that their closeness to Vanessa was punishment for me. I am telling you that the geography of my adult life was shaped by the financial constraint that was shaped by the debt that was shaped by the choice my parents made. And the choice they made also happened to produce a daughter who lived 4 hours away and therefore required more effort to maintain a relationship with, and I do not know whether this was an outcome they considered or whether it simply happened alongside everything else, but I know it was an outcome. In the years between graduation and the attorney's office, I had 3 significant conversations with my mother about money, and in each of them I raised, in various forms, the question of the education fund and what had happened to it, not as an accusation, but as a genuine effort to understand, something that had never been fully explained to me and whose explanation had always felt incomplete. And in each of these conversations, I received the specific experience of being managed, rather than informed, the experience of talking to someone who has the full picture and is releasing portions of it with careful intention rather than sharing it freely, and I recognized the management without being able to name what was being managed. In the first conversation, when I was 23 and the loan repayments had just begun, and the number had a new concreteness that the abstract amount had not previously had, my mother reiterated the investment error story and added to it the detail of the financial advisor who had been dismissed from the bank, a detail so specific that it functioned as a kind of evidence, the specificity of a false story that has been elaborated over time to answer the questions it anticipates. In the second conversation, which happened when I was 25 and had just received the notice that my loan balance had crossed the $30,000 threshold, and I was calculating how many more years I was going to be carrying this. My mother said that these things happened, that the financial crisis had affected a lot of people's savings, and that she and my father were sorry it had worked out this way. The financial crisis, which had occurred when I was 17, and which had nothing to do with an education fund that had been drawn down over the course of 2.5 years by a 22-year-old spending money that was not hers. But I did not know that then. In the third conversation, which happened when I was 28, I said to my mother directly that I had never fully understood the mechanics of what had happened with the fund, that the explanation I had been given had never felt complete, and that I would like to understand it properly, and my mother said she understood my frustration and that she and my father had done their best to make things right for me in the years since. And I said, "Mom, I am carrying $42,000 in debt from a fund that was supposed to cover my education." And she said, "We know, and we're sorry." And I said, "Is there anything you're not telling me?" And she said, "No." And she said it in the specific way that people say no when the answer is yes. And I heard the yes, and I did not know what to do with it. 3 months after that conversation, I was referred to Gerald Marsh by my colleague at work, not in connection with my family, but in connection with an estate matter involving my grandfather's will, which I had been told contained provisions I had not been made aware of, and in reviewing the estate documents Gerald Marsh found, without my asking him to look for it, the record of the education fund account. He found it because the fund had been established under my grandfather's estate, and the estate records contained the account history, and the account history told a story that was entirely different from the story I had been told for 9 years. He laid it out for me across the 20 minutes I have already described: the deposits and the withdrawals, the dates and the amounts, the pattern of withdrawals that corresponded precisely to Vanessa's enrollment period, the final balance, and the date on which my parents had received a full accounting from the bank of the account activity, which was 6 weeks before my mother called me in July to tell me there had been administrative errors. They had known for 6 weeks before they called me. They had known what happened, had received the documentation, had spoken to the bank, and had had 6 weeks to decide what story they were going to tell me. And the story they chose was the one I had been living inside for 9 years. I sat in Gerald Marsh's office, and I looked at the documents, and I thought about the specific quality of a life built on a foundation that turned out to be false. Not false in every respect. The degrees and the work and the relationships and the person I had become were real, but false in the foundational financial sense, in the sense that the shape of my adult life had been determined in part by a debt that should not have existed. And I thought about the 3 conversations with my mother and the specific way she had said no when the answer was yes, and I thought about the graduation, where my parents had been genuinely proud of me for something I had achieved despite what they had done. And I thought about Vanessa at the holiday tables, where I had always been the one who felt slightly outside the warmth and now understood the architecture of that feeling in a way I had not before. I drove home from Gerald Marsh's office, and I sat in my apartment for 3 hours before I called my mother. I did not call because I needed to perform the confrontation. I called because I had been told a lie for 9 years by people I loved, and the lie had shaped my life in specific and measurable ways, and I needed them to know that I knew, and I needed that knowledge to be spoken between us, acknowledged and witnessed, because unexpressed truth has a specific weight that only lives when it is said out loud. My mother answered on the second ring. I said, "I have been meeting with an attorney about Grandpa's estate." She said, "Oh?" I said, "He found the education fund account records." There was a silence that was longer than any pause I had ever heard from my mother, a silence that had a specific quality, the quality of a person who has been carrying something for 9 years and has just heard the sound of the ground giving way beneath it. She said, "Nadia?" I said, "And know what happened?" She said, "There is more to this than you understand." I said, "I have the account history. I have the withdrawal dates. I have the date the bank sent you the full accounting, which was 6 weeks before you called me about administrative errors." I said that last part without anger and without the performance of not being angry, just as the fact it was. And my mother said nothing for a long time, and I waited, because I had learned that waiting was the only thing that produced honesty from my mother when she was trying to decide whether to tell me the truth. And after a long time, she said, "We didn't want to hurt Vanessa." I said, "I know." I said, "You didn't want to hurt Vanessa, so you hurt me instead." She said, "We didn't mean it that way." I said, "I have $47,000 in student loan debt, Mom." I said, "Debt that has shaped every financial decision I have made for 7 years." I said, "Debt that is the direct result of money that Vanessa spent and that you and Dad covered for her and told me was a bank error." She said, "We helped you as much as we could." I said, "You helped me with the consequences of a lie you told me." I said, "You helped me manage the fallout of a story you constructed to protect Vanessa, and you want to count that as help." She said, "Nadia, please." She said, "This is not simple." I said, "It is actually very simple, Mom." I said, "Your daughter spent $64,000. That included $32,000 of my education money. And instead of telling me the truth and holding her accountable, you told me it was a bank error and let me spend the next 9 years carrying debt she should have been carrying." She said, "Vanessa was in trouble." I said, "I know she was in trouble." I said, "And when she was in trouble, instead of asking me to be part of the solution, you made me the solution without asking me and without telling me, and you have been watching me be the solution for 9 years." There was a silence after that, and it had a different quality from the earlier silence. It was not the silence of someone deciding how much to reveal. It was the silence of someone who has heard a true thing and is sitting inside the truth of it for the first time without the protection of the story they have been carrying. My mother said, "We thought it was the best way." I said, "The best way for whom?" She did not answer. My father was at home when my mother had this call with me. I know this because I heard him in the background, and he called me 2 hours later, and what he said was different from what my mother had said, different in the specific way that my father is different from my mother, which is that my father, when he has done something wrong, will acknowledge it in terms that are clear rather than managing the acknowledgement toward the least painful version, and he said, "Nadia, we made a bad decision and we have owed you an explanation for a long time, and I am sorry we did not give you one." I said, "What made it okay to lie to me?" He said, "It wasn't okay." He said, "At the time, it felt like we were managing an impossible situation, and we made the choice to protect Vanessa because she was the one in immediate crisis, and we told ourselves that we would make it up to you, that we would help you in other ways, that the damage was manageable, and none of that was true." I said, "It wasn't your decision to make." I said, "The money was mine." I said, "The decision about what to do about Vanessa spending it was mine." I said, "You took that from me when you decided for me." He said, "Yes." He said, "We did." He said it without the qualifications my mother had used, without the "this is more complicated than you understand," without the protective language of people who are acknowledging a thing while trying to minimize it simultaneously. He said, "We did, and I am sorry." I want to tell you about what happened with Vanessa because I think it is the part of the story that is hardest to resolve and therefore the part that requires the most honesty. I called Vanessa 3 days after the conversation with my parents. She picked up on the 4th ring, which told me my parents had spoken to her and she had been waiting. She said, "I know why you're calling." I said, "Okay." She said, "I have been wanting to talk to you about this for years." I said, "Years?" She said, "Yes." I said, "You have wanted to talk to me for years about the fact that you spent my education money and watched me carry the debt from it for 7 years?" She said, "I know how that sounds." I said, "How does it sound?" She said, "Terrible." She said, "It sounds terrible." She said, and it was. I want to be honest with you about what happened after that, because Vanessa's version of the 9 years was different from mine in ways that are important to the full truth of the situation. And the full truth requires both versions to be present, because the full truth of most situations involving families requires more than one person's version, and I think it is dishonest to tell a story in which only one version exists. Vanessa had not known that my parents told me it was a bank error. She had known that my parents were managing the situation, that they had spoken to her, that they had arranged for the consequences to be absorbed in ways that protected her. But she had believed, she told me on this call, that the arrangement involved my parents contributing additional money to cover the gap, that they had told me the truth about what she had done, and that they had arranged with me, with my consent, to handle it through family resources. She had believed for 9 years that I knew. I sat with that, the specific quality of it, the discovery that the lie my parents had told me had also, in a different form, been told to Vanessa, that the version of events my parents had constructed had not merely deceived me, but had also allowed Vanessa to live inside a belief that my cooperation had been given, when it had never been asked for. She had thought I had agreed to absorb the cost. She had spent 9 years believing her family had come together to help her, and that I had been part of that help. And the belief had not been malicious. It had been the honest misapprehension of someone who had been told a story about their family that was generous to everyone in it, including her, including me, and she had lived inside that story and felt the weight of owing something to the family that had absorbed the cost of her mistake, and the weight had expressed itself in the ways I described, in the extra warmth at holidays and the specific attention to my loan repayment, and I had received all of that warmth and attention without the context that would have made it fully comprehensible, which is the experience of receiving something true that is surrounded by something false, which is a disorienting way to receive anything. I asked her, on that phone call, what she would have done if she had known what our parents had told me. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I would have told you myself." She said, "I would have been horrified." She said, "I was in a terrible place at 22 and I made terrible choices, and I have lived with the weight of those choices for a decade, but I did not consent to my family lying to you about them, and I want you to know that if I had known what they told you, I would not have let it stand." I believed her, not because believing her was comfortable, or because it resolved everything, but because the specific quality of what she said had the texture of something true, the texture that is different from the texture of something managed, and I have spent enough time in my life listening to managed things that I have developed some ability to distinguish them. She had felt guilty, she said, not for the specific reason I now knew she should have felt guilty, but for the more general guilt of someone who has caused a problem that her family had to solve, and she had expressed that guilt to me over the years in ways I had received as vague and had not understood. The extra effort to be warm at Christmas, the times she had asked how the loan repayment was going in a tone that had seemed oddly specific and that I had attributed to ordinary family concern. She had been asking because she thought she knew why the loan existed. She had not known the full shape of what her parents had done. I want to tell you that this discovery made everything simpler, but it did not make everything simpler because it is not possible to fully separate Vanessa's responsibility for spending money that was not hers from the additional layer of our parents' decision to construct a story around it, and the story my parents constructed did not undo the original act, it built on top of it, and the responsibility for both the original act and the construction is distributed across multiple people in ways that are not clean and do not result into a single clear verdict. What I know is this. My sister spent money that was mine at 22 and made choices she has spent years regretting, and the regret has been genuine, and the genuine regret is worth something even if it is not everything. And my parents made a decision to protect her from the full consequences of those choices in a way that required me to bear costs I had not agreed to bear and did not know I was bearing, and they sustained that decision for 9 years through the maintenance of a story that was not true, and sustaining of it was wrong in a way that the original decision, however flawed, was not. Because the original decision was made in crisis, and the sustaining of it was made in cold calculation across 9 years of watching me manage a debt they knew the full origin of. I told my parents what I needed in the conversation that came after the one I have described, the conversation that is always the harder one, the one after the acknowledgement, the one that requires the parties to figure out what the acknowledgement means for the actual living of the relationship. Going forward, I told them I needed the debt to be retired. I said it plainly, without negotiation, without preface. I said, "The $47,000 in loans that I am carrying is the direct consequence of your decision, and I need it to be addressed." My father said, "We will take care of it." He said it the way he had said "I'm sorry," without qualification, without negotiating the terms, and I believed him, and he was right to be believed, because within 60 days the remaining loan balance had been paid, not in a dramatic gesture but in the methodical way that my father handles things. he has decided to handle, which is to make a plan and execute it and let the execution speak. The payment did not give back the years. I want to be honest about that because I think there is a version of the story where the debt being paid resolved the account, and I do not want to tell that version because the account does not resolve. Because the money was not only money, it was the shape of my 20s, it was the city I moved to, it was the opportunities I did not pursue. It was the specific texture of scarcity that lived in the background of every financial decision I made for 7 years, and none of that is returned by the retirement of a loan balance. But it was something. It was the acknowledgement made concrete, the acknowledgement given practical form. And practical form is how abstract things become real, and I needed it to be real. My relationship with Vanessa is in the process of becoming something honest, which it has not been. Not fully. Not in the way that honesty requires both people to be in possession of the same facts, and we are working toward that, slowly and with the specific difficulty of a relationship that has been operating on false information from both ends for a long time, and the working toward it has a quality I did not anticipate, which is that the honesty, once introduced, has made the relationship larger rather than smaller, because the relationship we had before the honesty was bounded by the false story on both sides, and the false story was a smaller container than the truth. And now that the truth is the container, the relationship has more room to exist in, and Vanessa and I have been filling that room with conversations we could not have had before, conversations about what each of us understood about the other and about our parents and about the family we grew up in and about the decade we each spent inside different versions of the same lie. She apologized. Not once, but repeatedly, and in the specific form of someone who is not managing the apology toward the minimum required, but is genuinely trying to reach the full size of it, and I received the apologies with the understanding that they were coming from a person who also felt deceived, who had also been placed inside a false story by our parents, who had also been protected in ways that turned out to cost more than the protection was worth. We are not where we were. We are somewhere more honest than where we were. And honest is the only foundation that holds over time. My parents and I are in the difficult and ongoing work of a relationship after a betrayal, which is a specific kind of work that requires both parties to be clear-eyed about what happened and committed to something different going forward, and we are doing that work imperfectly and with the particular friction of people who love each other and have also hurt each other and are trying to hold both of those truths without letting either of them collapse into the other. My father said, last Thanksgiving, at the table where we have eaten Thanksgiving dinner, my entire life, that he'd never been as wrong about something as he was about this. And he said it with the full weight of a man who does not speak in hyperbole, and who chose those specific words because they were accurate. I said, I know. I said, I believe you. I said, but I need you to understand that being wrong about it doesn't make it smaller in the way that I think you hope it does. He said, I know that. He said, I know it doesn't. The accountability, when it finally arrived, when my parents had nothing left to say in defense of what the documents showed, arrived not with the force I had imagined in the years before I knew what I was looking for, but with something quieter and in some ways harder to hold, which was the recognition that the people who had done this were people I loved, who had done it out of the same instinct that had produced everything good in my childhood, which was the instinct to protect, taken past the point where protection for one person was compatible with fairness to another, and the recognition of that instinct does not make the action okay, but it makes the action comprehensible in a way that allows me to continue being in the same family as the people who committed it. That is where I am. Continuing. Not pretending the last 10 years were something other than what they were, not absorbing the wrong into a narrative that excuses it, but also not allowing it to be the only story about my family. Because the only story about my family is not the false one, and it is also not the true one. It is both, of them held together, which is the specific challenge of loving people who have failed you, which is the challenge of most families most of the time, and which is harder and more necessary and more honest than any single version of the story. I am 31 years old, and my loans are paid, and my family is in the slow and imperfect process of being rebuilt on a foundation that is at least real, and the realness is the thing I would not trade. Not for the easier version of the story, not for the comfort of continuing to believe the bank error, because the real thing even when it hurts, is the only thing that is actually load-bearing. I want to say one thing to whoever is watching this who has been made to pay the price for someone else's protected secret. You are allowed to ask for the documents. You are allowed to find a Gerald Marsh and sit in an office with a folder in your lap and read what the documents say about the years you have been living inside a story that was not fully true. You are allowed to name what you find. You are allowed to say, out loud and without apology, that the cost you have been carrying was not yours to carry, and that it needs to be addressed. And you are allowed to do all of this without destroying the people involved, because naming the truth and destroying the people are not the same action. And the people who need you to believe they are the same are the people who benefit from your silence. The truth does not destroy. The truth is what is left when the things that cannot hold weight have finally given way. I sat in Gerald Marsh's office with a folder in my lap, and the truth was inside it, and what came after was hard and is ongoing, and is also the only version of my life that I can actually stand on. Stand on the truth, even when it takes 10 years to find. It is always there. It is always waiting. And when you find it, you will know. Thank you for being here until the very end. If this story reached something real in you, tell me in the comments. Tell me about the price you were made to pay. Tell me what the documents showed when you finally found them. I read every single one. I will see you next time.